I know I've showed you some uses of the calc function in CSS, but let's dive a little more deeply into the CSS calc function so we can learn how it actually works. The calc function allows you to perform computations when specifying CSS property values. It's especially useful for calculating things like length, percentage, time, numbers, integers, frequencies, and angles, just to name a few. One of the CSS calc's function's superpowers is the ability to combine different units. This function can perform math calculations that even preprocessors cannot do. Some general guidelines on how to use calc are that you should always use calc for values. The only place that you can use the calc function is in values, and I'll show you some examples shortly. Calc is used for lengths and other numeric types of things. All of the examples that I'll show you are basically going to be number-based. Sometimes we can use numbers with units and sometimes without, but for the most part, it all deals with numeric types of values. One of the awesome things about calc is that you can mix units. So you could add percentages with pixels or ems with vertical height. And this makes it really flexible and really awesome. At this point, you're not able to use calc inside of media queries. So when you're setting something like a min width, it would be great if you could use calc to calculate the actual value, but sadly that does not work yet. Hopefully that's something that they'll add into the specification in the future. You can use the math operators of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Addition and subtraction require both numbers to be lengths, while multiplication requires one of the numbers to be unitless, and division always requires the second number to be unitless. And again, I'll show you examples of this shortly. Finally, whitespace matters. When you're writing out your CSS using calc, you need to make sure that the math operator has whitespace on both sides. In general, when we use CSS, whitespace doesn't matter too much, but in regards to using calc, the whitespace is very important. Now that you have these guidelines, let's see how we can use calc in an actual example. We'll start off by looking at this simple example. On this page, I simply have a main element and it has 8 divs inside of it. I've already created some CSS. I'm using some CSS variables for colors. I've set the margin, padding, and box sizing on everything. And I have some general rules on the body that are pretty much just setting general styles on how the page is going to look. Finally, I'm using a display of flex on main, and I'm using flex wrap of wrap. The divs are also flex elements, and that's simply so that I can align the text in the middle both horizontally and vertically. Then I have a background color and a border on the divs, and I have some padding assigned to them. As you can see, if my page gets smaller, eventually the divs are going to wrap onto subsequent lines if necessary. What we'll do here is we'll use some calc so that we can style this page a little bit differently. As I mentioned before, you can use calc on any sort of value where you're using a number. So this could even be something like font size. Here I have my font size set to 120%. That means that whatever the base font size is, we're increasing it by 120%. So what I can do here is I can go ahead and I can put the calc function here. I can open up the parentheses, and we can go ahead and we can write something different. Inside of the parentheses, I could say 16 pixels, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to multiply that by 1.2. Remember what I mentioned before. When you use multiplication, you need to make sure that one of the numbers is unitless. So I can't multiply 16 pixels by 120%, but if I set this to 1.2, I should get the same results. So when I refresh my page, nothing changes. If we change this value to 1.5, then essentially we're going to be multiplying the base font size by 150%, and now all of the text will increase accordingly. I'm just going to set this back to 1.2 for our purposes here. As you can see, the elements themselves are butting right up to the edge of the page. And if my browser is wide enough, they will extend to the right edge of the area as well. I want to have a little bit of spacing between the edge of my browser and the elements inside. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to specify a width value. And for our width, we'll use calc. We're going to set the width of main to 100%. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to subtract 2 rems from that value. In addition to this, let's go ahead and set our margin. We'll set our margin to 2 rems for the top and the bottom and auto for the right and the left. If we save our page and we refresh, you're now going to see how we have some spacing around the edges. As I increase or decrease my page size, the width of main is always going to be 100% minus 2 rems, so it'll automatically calculate that value. If we change this value to percent based, so if we change this to 5% and we save and refresh, you will see that if I resize my page, the spacing that we get is going to increase or decrease based on the size of my page. So if I increase my page size, 5% becomes a larger amount. If we decrease the page size, this spacing is going to decrease. And you can go ahead and specify any units that you want within this calculation. Now that we have that in place, let's go ahead and add some width onto the divs themselves. I'm going to specify that the width is equal to, and then we'll use calc here as well. And let's go ahead and set this to 100%. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say minus, and we'll subtract 2 rems. I'll save, and if we refresh now, you're going to see how the width of these items does not quite extend across the entire width of the page. They're going to take up 100%, and then we're going to leave off 2 rems. What I would like to do here is I would like these elements to sit side by side. So if we change this value to 50%, and again, I'm subtracting 2 rems, that will allow these to sit side by side. So we are going to have more spacing on the right. But ultimately, we can actually use calc so that we can create multiple columns. We'll go ahead and we'll set the width to 100%. And then instead of using subtraction, I'm going to say divide, and then we're going to divide by 8. If we save our page now and we refresh, you will see that all of the items are going to sit side by side. I've essentially created 8 columns. If I increase the size of my browser, they will stay in this formation. And as you can see, the boxes are going to grow and shrink, and they're always going to take up this 8 columns. What I would ultimately like to do here is I would like some spacing between the boxes. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to come to main, and we're going to add some gap. Let's just add a gap of 1 rem. If we refresh now, you'll see that we get some spacing in between the boxes. And because we have spacing, we can no longer fit the boxes in the 8 columns because the gap is taking up extra spacing. To make this a little bit easier, let's actually set the gap to pixels. We'll use 10 pixels. This is going to look similar, but it's just going to shrink these together. We still have the same problem where no matter what size the browser window is, the boxes cannot make 8 columns, and that's because of the gap. But using a little bit of math on calc, we can include this in our calculation. So I'm going to use 100% divided by 8. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say minus, and in this case, if we write 10 pixels and we save our page, you will see that the boxes are going to now sit side by side, and we will get our 8 columns on the page. So this resolves the issue because we've included this within our mathematical calculation. First, we divide 100% by 8, then we subtract 10 pixels. And this allows the browser to take care of the math so that these items are going to sit side by side. If we decide we want a 4-column layout, I can simply change the value inside of calc, and then when we refresh, the layout is going to update according to our new calculations. As you can see, we are using a combination of division and subtraction, and as I mentioned before, when you do division, the second number has to be unitless, and we're also mixing values. We're using percentages and pixels. Because the order of operations will automatically perform the division first, we don't have to wrap this part of our equation inside of separate parentheses. But if we did have something where the order of operations wasn't so straightforward, we may need to nest in some additional parentheses. And that's something that you can do if you're performing more complex calculations as well. Let's look at one more example in regard to how we can use calc on an actual web page. This is the web page that I have so far. I am adding in a Google font, a link to Font Awesome, a link to our custom style sheet, and this page has a little bit more content. I have a main element that wraps around everything. Inside of that, I have a header that contains an H1 with an image and some text, an H2, and then I have another H2 that contains a Font Awesome icon plus some text. And then we have a paragraph, an image, another paragraph, an image, and a paragraph and another H2 along with another paragraph. In my CSS, I'm using some CSS variables for the color. I have some basic CSS set as a universal selector, some basic rules on my body, H1, H2, a general rule that make my images responsive. I have a margin bottom on my header, a rule on margin for main, and then we have header H1, and we're displaying this element as flex. This just allows the logo to sit next to the text. And finally, on the logo, I'm sizing this down because it is an SVG. So this is currently what my page looks like. As you can see, the content is going to grow until the images max out at their full entire width, and the text is going all the way to the edge. So we're going to go ahead and add some additional CSS to make this page look a little bit better. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into main, and we're going to give main a max width. So I'm going to set the max width to 1000 pixels. You can see that as my page gets wide, the page is going to eventually max out at 1000 pixels, and then it stays centered because of our margin auto. In addition to max width, when my page is less than 1000 pixels, I do want to create some spacing on the right and the left. So we're going to do that by using our calc function. I'll go ahead and add width, and then I'm going to use calc, and in here we're going to set the calc to 100 VW, which is the viewport width, and then we're going to subtract 4 M's. If we save now and we refresh our page, you will see that we now have 4 M's of space around the right and the left. So as my page gets smaller, we will always have that additional space on the right and the left of the page. Because of our max width, our page is never going to get bigger than the 1000 pixels. So this is one way in which we can use calc just to make our page look a little bit better. What I want to do next is when my page is displayed in this way, I would like my images to span the entire width of the page. So I don't want them to be controlled by this extra spacing that we have, the 4 M's on the right and the left. In order to do this, we're going to target these two images, and it is worth mentioning that I've given these images a class of full width. So inside of my CSS, I'm going to come down to the bottom. I'll make a new rule for full width. We're going to set the max width to 100 VW. We need this so we can override what may be defined on our regular images. In addition to this, I'm going to set the width to 100 VW. If we save our page now and we refresh, you will see that the images now extend to the right of our page, but I do have horizontal scrolling and we still have the space on the left. To be able to resolve this issue, I'm going to use a margin and we'll set the top and the bottom to 0, and then we're going to use calc. Inside our parentheses, we're going to use negative 50 VW. If we simply use this, you will see that what it's going to do is it's going to pull the images to the left, and we get rid of our horizontal scrolling, but the images are being cut off by half, and that's because we've slid them over 50% essentially of the vertical width to the left. So inside of the calc function, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add 50% to this value. If we save now and we refresh, you will see how the images now span the entire width of the page. So they are going to take up the full width of the page. And this is going to be true even when our page extends past that 1000 pixels. So this is overriding what we had written before, and this allows the images to take up the full entire width. In addition to this, I'm going to also set a max height, and we'll set this to 25 VH, which stands for vertical height. If we just leave it like this and we refresh, you'll notice that the images do unproportionately scale. So to resolve this issue from happening, I'm going to add an object fit property, and we'll set this value to cover. This is going to fix the issue of the images unproportionately scaling, and what it's going to do is it's going to crop a portion of the images out. So you can see how my images now get clipped. This works in the same way as when you set a background image and specify that the size is set to cover. And let's actually give these a max height that is just slightly higher. We'll set that to 30 VH. All right, I like how that is looking. Finally, we're going to do something similar on this H2. And this last H2 in the HTML, I've already given it a class of focus, and I just did this so that we could practice some of the things that we're learning here. So I'm going to make a rule for h2.focus. Let's go ahead and set the background color, and we're going to use a value of accent color. Then what we'll go ahead and do is we'll set the text color, and we're going to use one of our variables for that as well. I'll use my dark color. I'm going to use text align center. We're going to set the width to 100 VW, just like we did on our images. And for our margin, we're going to set our margin to 2 rems for the top. We're going to use calc, and inside we're going to use the same sort of math. We're going to set this to negative 50 VW plus 50%, and then I'm going to set padding all the way around of 2 rems. If we save now and we refresh, you're going to see how this H2 has the same sort of behavior as our images. So as I resize my page, that background yellow is going to span the entire width. It no longer follows the rules that we specified earlier where we're setting this margin of 4 rems. The last thing that I want to point out is when you do something like this, you will notice that you still can scroll to the right a little bit. And the reason that this occurs is in most browsers, if your page has vertical scrolling, you can see that once I start to scroll, I'm in Chrome right now, I get that vertical scroll bar. So this extra little bit of space is because of the vertical scroll bar. To resolve this, all we have to do is go to our body, and we're going to go ahead and just set the overflow X to hidden. And if we refresh in the browser now, you will see that if I try to scroll to the right and the left, I no longer get that little bit of spacing. So that's going to just take care of that. In some browsers, it might be more apparent than it is in this particular one, but this is how you can fix something like that. So when we use vertical width, it counts the space underneath the scroll bar, and using overflow X will get rid of that. As you can see, there's a lot of flexibility in how you can use the calc function. I'm sure you'll be able to find additional ways to incorporate it into your projects. It is very useful and allows you to perform some sophisticated mathematical computations right inside your CSS.